Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel, Dr Holly Psychologist, that's me, and today we're going to be reviewing one of our most popular videos. So we've done a little bit of a rejig. Now I've got some experience as a qualified psychologist of doing assistant psychologist interviews. We wanted to do a bit of a rejig. So here is my latest advice on how to get through an assistant psychologist interview. And this kind of is born from my experience now of interviewing as an interviewer and being an assistant, and going for between 50 and 60 assistant psychologist job interviews in my 5 years of trying to get an assistant psychologist job. So yes, I have lots of experience of doing interviews for assistant psychologist jobs with variable degrees of success. I only had one AP job, although I was successful in 2. So yes, but anyway, let's get into it. So we are going to talk a little bit briefly about what an assistant psychologist does. We're going to think about how you apply, like where do you actually go to apply to these jobs, and some information about interviews, what they might be like, what to expect. Also, we're going to look at how to prepare and types of questions and how best to answer the questions, and some tips for kind of structure, and also what to do afterwards. So what is an assistant psychologist then? Well, an assistant psychologist works as part of a team, often a multidisciplinary team, and that is a team built of different disciplines. So it could be medicine, dietitians, physios, nursing. It could be a whole load of different disciplines. And APs support people with mental health issues. They always work under the supervision of a qualified practitioner psychologist. So that can be a clinical psychologist, counselling, education, forensic, health. I think they're all the practitioner psychologists. So you will always be working under the supervision of a qualified practitioner psychologist that holds the clinical responsibility really for the work that we do. Assistant psychologist roles vary really, like they are hugely varied, and they can either be band 4 or band 5 in the NHS. And in the private sector, they often do kind of match with the bandings like that, but they can be quite different as well. Duties of an AP, though, can include offering assessments, offering some intervention work, often low-intensity stuff, and you should really have had some training in that, or at least be doing that under supervision. And that can be with clients, it can be with family members as well. And often a big part is around audit, researchy, quality improvements, service evaluation stuff, and contributing to team meetings and formulations and things like that. So it can be a really varied role. So it really depends on which service you're in. They can be part-time, they can be full-time. Often people do have like 2 part-time roles and they're split across services, so it can be that as well. So how do you apply then? Well, in the NHS, you go to the NHS jobs website and you search for assistant psychologist in the area that you want to work in, so the location that you want to work in, and you follow the links to apply. Private or charity sector, generally you go straight to their website, but they can sometimes come up on NHS jobs as well. You can use things like Indeed sometimes as well, but usually ideally we want to be looking at the NHS, because if you're looking at getting onto training, which AP roles generally are, it's kind of expected that you're going to go on to training at some point after this AP role. Then ideally you want some knowledge of how psychology works in the NHS. That's really important. And we also have a video on assistant psychologist applications too. So we're going to do a review as well, but yeah, there is an older one on there as well, so you'll find, I'll link it down below. So we also do have a range of guides available, and this is the one that's probably most relevant to you guys watching. We've got a big document, PDF and physical copy available to buy, and I'll put the link down below, all about how to become an assistant psychologist. So we go through how to do an application, how to write a CV, how to get experience, how to do the interview, what sort of interview prep you might need, how to do reflective practice. Everything's in there, so do definitely check that out. And we do provide the PDFs for free, so have a look at the page there and you'll be able to email me for free. So you've applied, let's say, and you get an invitation to interview. I just want to say a note on numbers, because getting an interview is huge, right? Sometimes there's one position and as many as 100 to 150 people can apply for one position. Okay, so the success rate can be really, really small. It's really important to remember that. It's not actually about you as such. It's often about the numbers, so recently, I helped with some recruitment of an assistant psychologist. There were 80 odd applications that we then longlisted. The longlisted were down to sort of 20-ish, and then we interviewed six to eight. Yeah. So the numbers are just mad. And if you think about the numbers for doctorate, the doctorate success rate is about 25% now, because the places have increased and everything. So it's actually statistically easier to get onto the doctorate than it is to get an AP job. So and that isn't said to scare you. That's just so you're going into this with your eyes open. So I think one of the things I naively did when I came out of my master's is, I'll apply to assistant jobs. A lot of assistant jobs later, not even getting an interview because I didn't have any experience. I was like, okay, this is actually much harder than I thought it was going to be. So sometimes that is as many people, and up to 10 people can be interviewed for the role. Sometimes it's as little as 3, depending on what the situation is. Sometimes it's as little as 1 or 2, but unlikely in an assistant one. But up to around 10 probably will be interviewed for the role. So again, that's still a 1 in 10 chance, let's say, that you get it. So it's tricky. If you do get an invitation, you will probably be sent an email to the address that your account is linked to. And then you'll be asked to confirm whether you want to attend the interview. And you'll either be asked, when I was applying for AP roles, they used to offer you choices of time slots. I think some places do, some don't. But often now you're just assigned the next available one. You will be able to find out if the interview is in person or online, and you should be able to request. They may not be able to be flexible about it, because often if a service is offering assistant interviews or any interviews, they've blocked out a certain amount of time in their calendars with a room, and that is often 2 or 3 people that need to coordinate their diaries and get a room booking, which is really tricky. And it's quite unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely, that if you say, actually I can't do the Wednesday, could I do the Thursday, they may be able to accommodate it, but they may not. And similarly with online and face-to-face, they may not. So they're just things to be aware of. And if you are invited to interview, what you can expect, some of them will be all online, some will be all in person, there may be a mix. You can expect I don't remember ever having just one person interviewing me. Not in the NHS. It will always be at least another person, sometimes 3, maybe more. Sometimes there will always be a clinical psychologist or a practitioner psychologist. There may be, I work in physical health, so there may be another member of the multidisciplinary team, medicine, nursing, physio, dietitian. There could be someone else in the room, and there may be a person with experience on the panel as well, or there may be another psychologist. So it really varies, but yeah, you will often be seeing multiple people, which can feel quite daunting. And they will be writing notes as you're talking, just writing down your answers, because it helps them score at the end. And what happens is everybody gets a score. NHS trusts do this a bit differently, but each interviewer will score you and then discuss the scores at the end, basically, and see where you fit with the other candidates. Assistant psychologist interviews can be really, the competition can be really tight. So you may have the same score as somebody and still not get it because of various other reasons. It could be, they said a bit more, they seem to show a bit more knowledge about NICE guidance or the service or whatever it was. So it completely depends. So it can be really tight. And remember, it's not necessarily you. Sometimes it is you. Sometimes you're not experienced enough. Sometimes your interviewing skills need a little bit of work. But sometimes it's not. And looking at the numbers, what my message is, try not to take things too personally, because I absolutely did that for years. And then looking at the numbers, I was like, okay, this actually probably wasn't even about me. I definitely could have improved my skills, and I did, and every interview helps with that. But, you need the practice. So, how to prepare then? My first tip always is don't over prepare. I am somebody that... So, how to prepare? My first tip always is don't over-prepare. That is always my first tip, because I am definitely somebody that's like, right, I've got an interview, I need to read everything possible about everything to do with what I could be asked, and prep every question and practice answers. And trust me, it's just not helpful, actually. It really isn't. So what I would advise you prepping and thinking a bit about, and it doesn't have to be filling up notebooks or, taking loads of copious notes. It doesn't have to be that. Just thinking about some service-related factors. So things like, what is the service? What's your understanding? If you don't really know what the service does, give them a call and say, oh, I've got an interview, I'm really excited. Could you just tell me a little bit more about the service? Just so I can make sure that I understand really clearly how to answer the questions at my best. Something like that. You also want to know a little bit about the NHS Trust, if there's been any headlines recently, which are generally quite negative, but it's always helpful to be aware of these things and the values of the trust. And this is a piece of advice I had early on in my career, actually, when I was struggling to get an assistant job, is to look at the latest CQC reports for the service. They may not have one, because things work a bit, it's all a bit complicated, but they may not have one. If you're private or charity sector, they probably will have some form of report like that. So I'd have a little look and see what it says. And then you want to think about presentation related factors. This is important. So you want to think about the client groups that you're going to be interviewing or working with. So you want to think about, so if it's working in a community mental health team, then you need to know a little bit about severe and enduring mental illness. If you're working in a pediatric diabetes service, you need to know a little bit about pediatric diabetes and the experiences of people that have it. So thinking about the client group is really important. And that can be a really simple Google, see what comes up on the NHS website for that presentation. See what comes up on Google Scholar. Just on the first page of Google Scholar, just search it and see what comes up. And you also want to think about what life is like for clients with those challenges. So if it is pediatric diabetes, what's it actually like to live with pediatric diabetes? What's it at what different ages as well? What's it actually like to live with dementia? What's it like to care for somebody with dementia? Think about what actually it's like, because they are the things that psychology help with. So really thinking about that. And also, I would really recommend having a look at the NICE guidance, if there is any. If there isn't any, that's a good talking point as well. Because at some point you're probably going to be asked what your understanding is of the client group and how they present and what psychology can do to help. If there isn't any NICE guidance, you can say, well, actually, I've kind of looked and there isn't any NICE guidance, but also I did try and look at some of the evidence base, and the evidence base says CBT can be really effective for working with low moods. So thinking about that could be really valuable. And then also, just to get a bit of an understanding of what life is like for people with those challenges, look at some charities related to the presentation. So really focus on diabetes at the moment, but Diabetes UK is really good, and there's lots of other charities, like if it's cancer, looking at Macmillan, looking at Sue Ryder, there's loads of different things you can look at with it. Just to get an understanding. You can also take to YouTube and see if there's any YouTube stuff on what it's like to live with fibromyalgia, for example. So I definitely recommend. And it looks like, okay, I'm saying don't over prepare, but here's a massive list of things to prepare. And I think we just need to look at the scaling of what preparing means. So having a look at what the service does, that can just be, writing down a sentence of, this service supports people with chronic pain issues. It could literally just be that. So just having some understanding of the service, because sometimes people come into interviews and they have not done any prep at all about the client group, about what it's like to be that person or the family member, any sense of what psychology can do. There's none of that. So just having some ideas, and I'm not saying you need to spout out the whole NICE guidance. But what I'm saying is if it says CBT, then you can say, well, CBT helps. And I've looked at the evidence base and it says that using things like graded exposure is helpful for needle phobia, blah, blah, blah. It's that simple. It doesn't have to be really in depth, but just having something to say, it gives the interviewer something to write down and how you answer the question. So yeah, it doesn't have to be loads, but just think about each of these. And it can be as simple as just thinking about it, just going, right, if I woke up every day and I was in chronic pain, what would that actually feel like? What would that feel like for me? Really thinking about it. And then also the biggest thing is, how can psychology help? Because I think as an assistant psychologist, you're a graduate. You've got a degree in psychology. The thing that sets people apart, I would say, in AP interviews is how they understand what psychology can do. So sometimes people will say things like, oh, well, we'll listen to them and we'll be really supportive. Yeah, absolutely. But you'd be hard pushed to find a member of the MDT that doesn't do that. So what differentiates psychology? And again, that's specific CBT or ACT or, any of the models that you can try and use, or even just saying, oh, I'm drawing a blank a little bit on some of the models that we could use. But I know that, using some psychological models to really help people understand their experiences and see ways that we can make things a little bit better and focus on goals, they are the things that we do. If any of it comes back to me, I'll try and say, those sorts of things. Show your personality a little bit. So yeah, don't over prepare. Here are some things to look at. There's that fine balance. So, examples. I would prepare, and case studies makes it sound so formal. This does not have to be formal in any way. Just a couple of examples of experiences that you can talk about. That is what I would say. These could include a time where you worked well as part of a team, you had a disagreement with somebody or a conflict, you helped a client or their family, something that you learned in supervision, a time that you've done some research. They are the things that are helpful. And again, it doesn't have to be like, okay, a really full, here's a whole case study of everything that I did. It really doesn't. You want a little bit of, okay, here's what I did, here's what I learned, and here's how it applies to, what the role that I'm interviewing for. Again, don't over prepare. Don't do all of these. Don't think about time that you worked well as part of a team, had a disagreement, helped a client. Don't think about all of those, because I know what you like. That's what I was like. That's what we're all like trying to get into clinical psychology. We're over preparers. So really, really trust me. The time that I got my assistant psychologist job was when I went into the interview and I hadn't prepared much. I'd read a bit about the service. It was probably my 50 or 60th. It's in that range of assistant interviews, only assistant interviews. And I was like, right, do you know what? I'm never going to get one. I may as well just go and I'll talk and it'll be fine. And that was the time that I got it, because I took the pressure off myself. And I wasn't, dismissive or aloof or anything in the interview. But I didn't go into it thinking, okay, I must get this. It's so important. And here are all my examples and I've got to remember everything. I was like, it'll come out. If it comes out, it comes out. It'll be fine. So, yeah, trust yourself. Your questions. So this is something else to prep. Really think about the questions you want to ask them at the end. What do you genuinely want to know about the role? And are the hours unclear? Do you want to ask about flexibility, home working, compressed hours? You can ask those sorts of things. You could ask about opportunities for development, research, clinical work in the role. So things like, what current research projects do you have? That sort of thing. You could ask what the interviewers enjoy about working in the team. So somebody asked that actually in the recent round of interviews we did. And that was a really nice question. Again, it's that old adage of we all like talking about ourselves. So it's really nice that someone asked, actually, what do you really enjoy about it? Because, yeah, I think it shows an interest in other people. I think it demonstrates how you would ask a question to somebody, because part of the role is inevitably probably doing assessment stuff. So kind of modelling how you would do that is important. I would also say ending with no questions is a bit of a red flag, because it kind of makes me think, well, do you even want the job if you don't want to ask any questions about it? You haven't prepared for it either, is what it makes me think. And it doesn't have to be anything genius. At all. I think most of the time, I can't remember, what did I ask in my successful one? I think I asked something really basic, something like when do you want the person to start, and what does an average couple of days look like in this role? But it showed that I really wanted to know about the role. So yeah, don't say no, I've got no questions. Unless they provide you with the most thorough information, you can come up with some sort of question. So yeah, make sure you ask them something. Okay, We're on to types of questions and how best to answer them. I will caveat this with not all types of questions will be asked in an interview. It completely depends on the role, the NHS trust, private charity sector can be a bit different, and the service. It completely depends. But these are examples of questions that I've been asked in the assessment interviews. And I've asked people on the Instagram as well. If you don't follow us at the moment, make sure you find us at Dr Holly Psychologist on Instagram, because I do monthly Q&As and lots of other content on there as well. So yes, I asked the Instagram followers what questions they've been asking in assistant interviews, and they came up with these. So types of questions then. We have competency questions, knowledge questions, and scenarios. These are the three very, very broad types of questions, and you can get other ones, but these are the ones that will probably come up. Let's talk about competency questions. The aim is to assess your competence, your ability, your skills to do certain tasks that are related to the AP role. And they'll do that by asking about your experience. So tell us about a time when blah, blah, blah. They're the sort of things they'll ask you. They will be looking for stuff around clinical skills, if it's a particularly clinical role, so psychological assessment, if you've done any formulation work, if you've done any intervention work, building relationships. So how do you sit in a room with somebody and build that rapport, particularly with some client groups that really won't want to engage with you or won't trust you? How do you bridge that gap? And how are you with compassion and empathy? Those things are really important as well. Use of supervision they'll ask you about. They could ask you about how would you recognise your own competence limits, because that is an important part of being a psychologist, assistant, trainee, qualified. We have to recognise our own competence because that's how we safely practice. They might ask about team working and reflective practice. So there's a whole load of things that they may ask about, like managing your workload independently and working under supervision. So some examples. Things like, tell us about a time where you experienced a conflict at work. How did you manage it? We work as part of a multidisciplinary team. Tell us about your experience of this. What helps and hinders you in supervision? Tell us about some clinical work you've done and what you learned. Tell us about some research you've done and what you need to consider when doing research in this client group. So they are just some examples. There are loads of other types, but the job description and person spec should give you information about what they're looking for. So always have a check there and go, right, they've mentioned team working. They might ask me about what my experience is of working in a team. Or they want someone with experience of working with clients. Okay, they might ask me something clinically. And this is where those case studies can come in handy. You know, that the little tiny bit of prep that you did thinking, oh, okay, well, I've done a bit of client work with somebody and this is what worked well. On that question where you're asked to talk about clinical work you've done and what you learned, the pitfall people often fall into is that they spend way too much time explaining the client. And it's not even like, you firstly have to be careful about confidentiality, you know, and anonymity. And also it's not necessarily what the question is. Yes, the question is, what work have you done? But the focus is, what have you learned from it? That's the focus. So you don't have to go into the whole history and the whole assessment that you've done with somebody. You can just go into, I was working with this person, they were referred for support with low mood. So we did some guided self-help and some psychoeducation bits. And one of the things that, here are the things that I've learned. So you could go about it that way. I don't know if anyone can spot the subtext in all of these questions. You may not be able to, because that was a lesson I learned quite late. The subtext in all the questions really is, and how are you going to make this, how are you going to bring this learning to the AP role? They don't ask you that always. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they'll say, and how are you going to, apply that learning to this role? But often it's a really important thing to say at the end of your answer, something like, and that's why I think that I'd be really good in this role, because my experience of working clinically, I've got all the kind of skills of building rapport, of like understanding risk and safeguarding and confidentiality and having those conversations and using supervision. And I know that they are factors that, are going to play into this role as an AP. Something like that, because it makes them think, just having had a bit of interview experience, if someone had answered that way, I go, okay, they're really thinking about what it would be like to be an AP, which is great. So yeah, I definitely recommend that. So let's go through an example of a competency question then. tell us about some clinical work you've done and what you learned. So you may be talking about psychological, and all of these things that I'm going to talk about now are things that competencies that you may be showing through your answer. So they're the sort of things that you want to think about. So psychological assessment, it could be a bit of formulation work, intervention, consideration of the evidence-based and or guidelines, if there are any. If you've been doing some clinical work, like let's take psychoeducation about anxiety, for example. Well, we know that lots of the psychoed is about CBT. And CBT is really well evidenced in anxiety for a lot of populations. So there's a link there. Building rapport is a big one, I think, a lot of the time, because sometimes as an AP, you're a more junior member of the team. And I think patients and clients pick up on that and can sometimes feel slightly more affiliated with you than like particularly children or younger adults. They can perhaps relate a little bit more to you than they can to, the 75-year-old psychologist that you're being supervised by, or whoever. I'm not saying that all qualified psychologists are 75. I'm 31. But, they may be able to relate in a different way, is what I'm saying. And I think you can demonstrate quite clearly how you would build rapport with somebody based on how you're answering questions and how you are in the room. So they'll be picking up on that as well. Then thinking a little bit about risk, consent, confidentiality, if there's any things like that. So it could be a piece of clinical work where there was a risk and that you had to manage it and how you learned. It could be about reflective practice. You could be talking about a client that you worked with that really brought out some personal feelings in you. Maybe you didn't like them very much. Like, how do you navigate that? What do you do with that? You'd probably take it to supervision. And to be fair, if they ask you about clinical work, I'd always mention supervision. Because as an assistant, you're not a qualified member of staff. As I said, you're more like a junior member of staff. So an understanding of that supervision structure is very, very important. And also you're demonstrating, kind of like the building rapport, you're demonstrating an ability to communicate, which is so important because we work in talking therapy. So we need to be able to communicate with them. So some tips then for competency questions. I would explain the situation that you're going to talk about really clearly, and maybe don't go into too much detail about the situation. As I say, you don't need to go into their background. We want to know, 1, what you've learned, and 2, how you're going to apply it to this role. They are the 2 things really that the focus should be on. So you can use a structure. I'm going to go through the structures in a minute. But this can I often found this to be really difficult during an interview, like thinking, okay, I'm going to do the STAR method. Okay, what's S? What's T? What's A? Like, I found that really stilted, and I didn't come across as genuine. The assistant role that I did get, I didn't use any of these really. But I will tell you the structure that I did use. So I would also then, if you can, it's not always easy to do this in the moment, but trying to think of the competencies they're looking for in the role. So, like I said, if they're asking about team working, it's probably quite a big part of the role. So you need to make sure you focus on that. And actually answer the questions is so important because lots of people don't actually. So yeah, definitely doing that. And the other thing is, there's a lot to take in at an interview and you want to give your best answer. So if you want to take some notes, take some notes. If you want to take a sec to say, okay, let me just structure my answer in my head so I can give you the best answer I can, that's okay. What you're demonstrating there is 1, confidence, 2, knowledge of yourself. They're the 2 things that you're really demonstrating. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that. And 3, always try and end your answer with a link to how that competence is going to help you in the AP role that you're applying for. So some structures then. You can use what, so, what, now, what. If you follow the channel at all, then we do lots of stuff about reflective practice, or that's certainly how we started. And we've done lots of the reflective models. You can find all the videos for, and I can link them down below for you. But this is often a really common one in reflective models. It's what happened, so what, and now what. So what would be, what happened? What was the situation? And generally this would be quite brief, like a minute, like less than a minute, like really brief. It doesn't need to be, war and peace. So what was the result of the experience? What did you learn from the experience? What was the outcome? And I would try and pick 2 or 3 things that you've learned, and maybe that would be around 2 or 3 mins, something like that, And then now what? How do you apply that learning to the current role? So then connecting each of the 2 or 3 things that you said in the previous bit to an element of the role. And that will probably be a minute or so. So probably like a 4 or 5 minute answer, like is where you're probably looking at. It depends. It doesn't have to be that long. So yes, that would be what, so what, now what. Use the STAR method. Some people really like this. It's personally not for me. I found this all far too much to hold in my mind and give a succinct answer, but people like it. So it stands for situation. What was the situation? Task, what did you have to do? Action, what did you do? Response, what was the outcome? And how did you respond? How did the other person respond? And reflection, what did you learn? And how are you going to apply it? My preferred structure, which kind of still is a structure, but yeah, is firstly thinking about 2 to 4 points that you can make to answer that question. It depends on the question. Sometimes you might have more, or you might be able to say something like, oh, I've got lots of ideas going around in my head right now, like this, this, and this. But actually, I'm only going to talk about this. Yeah, I'm going to talk about these 2 because I feel like they are the most important. You know, it could be like that. I would say each point briefly, like I just did. So I'm going to talk about this, this, this. They're the 3 things that I'm going to talk about. Then you go, so firstly, talking about this one. Secondly, this one. Thirdly, this one. And then, like, lastly, you're going to say, so these are the 3 things that I think are really important in answering this question, or, you know, however the wording is. And this is why I think I could be really good in this role. So, yeah, that's my preferred structure. And it seems to have worked because of that. I got my qualified role that way and my assistant role. And, yeah, my training. Yeah, I got into training with that sort of structure as well. So, yeah, and it feels more natural to me to do it that way. Knowledge questions then. The aim of them is to assess your knowledge generally about the client group and psychology. And they do that by asking about your understanding of something, basically. So it can be things about the client group, families, carers, wider systemic factors, challenges that the client group may experience, how psychology can help, and the service, NHS Trust, the role, where it sits in the wider teams, etc. So some examples then. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are so many that they could ask. But why is multidisciplinary team working important in the NHS service with this client group? What factors should be considered in a thorough risk assessment? What are the challenges of our clients? As in, what challenges do they face? Not why are they challenging? Hopefully they will not ask you that. How can psychology help our clients? What are some unique factors to consider when working with this client group? And why do you want this role? And what do you understand the role to be? So some version of this question is probably going to be your first question, like why do you want the role? And I'd really think about that. Don't rehearse an answer, because that can always be like, you know, when somebody's rehearsed an answer, and you know as the interviewee if you've rehearsed an answer and it's not coming across well. So actually think about, well, why do you want the role? Not just, oh, I really want to be an assistant so I can get onto training. I mean, that may be a part of it. I'd put that maybe a little bit down the list. Don't make that your first point. Make it something about how you want to work with the client group and gain experience, you know, something like that. But yes, so that would probably be your first question in some way. And they are testing your knowledge of what the role is, and that's why doing some research about the service and the trust is important, because you need to understand what role you're applying for. If people don't know, it's really clear that they've done no research and they really don't know what the role of an AP is. So an example then, what do you need to consider when working with a parent of a teenager with an eating disorder? So this is a very specific question that will only really come up on in eating disorder services / inpatient mental health, possibly. Maybe community, I don't know, it may come up. But if they're asking specifically about an eating disorder, it'll probably be an ED service. So firstly, you want to be thinking about the wider context. You know, you're showing your knowledge of actually eating disorders often in teenagers are treated systemically. So they're treated with family therapy often, depending on how old the teenager is. If they're sort of 19, they probably would still want to use that method, but it depends because they're an adult, so it depends. But yeah, thinking about the wider context and also thinking about getting an eating disorder referral is tricky. Having that referral accepted can be very, very, very tricky. Getting to the top of the waiting list can be very tricky. So they've often waited a really long time for this support, and often the parent has been the only person supporting the teenager. So they probably have really had enough by now, and they're very tired and need a lot of support. Definitely something about building rapport There'll be something about ensuring that they have the support they need, and consideration of the evidence base and the guidelines, like I said, about the systemic stuff. And then confidentiality and the age of the teenager. So the teenager might be 19 and they might say, I don't want you telling my mum anything. And you then can't tell the mum anything. What you can do with mum or dad or whoever, guardians, aunties, uncles, is you can work with them for their issues, but it will be separate. And that will be okay, because if it's a teenager that's 13, that's a very different conversation. So some understanding of that would be important. Something around safeguarding issues if there are any. Reflective practice, working with eating disorders, working with anything can trigger things in us, but working with eating disorders can be a particularly triggering place for some people, depending on your background. So definitely thinking, how it is for you to be doing that work, using supervision, and remembering, this is where you show your knowledge of what the client group are going through. Parents will often forget themselves when their child is unwell, and eating disorders are chronic and can go on for a really long time. Again, linking with that wider context, they will have waited a long time for support, that they probably neglected themselves in lots of ways and don't know how to be kind to themselves anymore, because they probably feel a level of guilt, because all parents are going to feel a level of guilt for lots of things. And when your child is poorly, you're going to feel that level of guilt even more. And there could be a whole other range of things that are happening for them. So that's the way you can show your knowledge there. There'll be other things that I've missed, but there are some of the important things to show. So there, look at how much knowledge you're showing. So yeah, thinking about all the different types of knowledge that you can show. Some tips for knowledge questions. Try to answer the question. It sounds so basic, right? It really does sound stupid. Answer the question. And if you're not sure you remember exactly what the question is, ask. Just say, I think I might be straying away from the question here a little bit. What is the question? Sorry, could you mind repeating? Repeat it. Absolutely, that's completely fine. Like, we did that a couple of times in the interview process recently. I have no judgment at all about that, because I struggle to hold things in mind. I really need to see it written down. So I struggle to hold things in mind like that. So yeah, I think it actually shows personality as well. And demonstrate so try to answer the question and demonstrate all the knowledge you've learned about that client group in your prep. I mean, it doesn't have to be all the knowledge. That's maybe a bit misleading and a bit totalitarian. But yeah, just learning, demonstrating the knowledge, some of the knowledge that you've learned. So if it is about eating disorders, saying, well, I know that the NICE guidance says this, and that this is what we should do for confidentiality stuff. So you're showing, important bits. And this is such a big one that I learned probably too late. If you don't know something, it's okay to say so. And there's different ways you can say it. So, for example, I'm not actually sure, but I'd really like to learn in this role. An AP role is really developmental, and I'm really keen to learn. I think I'm in a really good place to do that based on my experience so far. I feel like the next logical step for me is an AP, that sort of thing. Or you can say, I don't know, to be honest. My previous experience, though, has taught me X, Y, and Z, which can be transferable in A, B, and C ways, something like that. Or, I really don't know, actually, but I would want to spend, when I start the role, I would want to spend a bit of time, getting to know the client group a little bit, and maybe, looking at some resources that have been developed for them, spending time with them, MDT, those sorts of things. And always try and link the knowledge to the new role. So something like, and that's why I'm ready for this role, because I've begun to learn about their challenges, and I feel really skilled to be able to start supporting them under your supervision, something like that. So, scenario questions then. The aim of them is to assess how you would apply your learning and skills to scenarios that you may encounter in that AP role. And they do that by asking what you would do in certain situations. So they could ask about conflicts in various arenas, like teams, with clients, with families. Sorry, that was my cat coming in. Very large and in charge through the cat flap. So they can ask about conflicts. They could ask about risk and or safeguarding situations. They could ask about inappropriate behaviour. So if you witness some inappropriate behaviour, and that doesn't have to be sexual misconduct or anything. It could be staff members using inappropriate language to talk about clients. It could be disengagement from clients. It could be a lot of different things. So some examples then. A young person discloses something to you that concerns you. What do you do? So there you'd be thinking about all the different risk and safeguarding procedures. You'd be explaining, in the room what you would do, and then outside of the room what you would do, and then long term what you would do. A client asks you to keep something secret. What do you do? You received a referral for a team as a team for a client who is described as manipulative. How would you respond to this in the moment? I was asked this in an assistant interview. And that's kind of what I mean about that inappropriate. Like, it's not okay really to be calling clients manipulative. That's quite a provocative word, and a very judgy word. So yeah, you've got to be careful thinking about that. Your client has recently disengaged. What would you do? You attend an MDT meeting where a complex client is being discussed. You make a suggestion and the response is, "Oh, we've tried everything and nothing works." What do you do? So they can sometimes be specific questions. They can sometimes be wider, like, your client has recently disengaged. What do you do? Well, disengagement could mean a lot of things, So an example then, a client asks you to keep something secret. What do you do? Well, you would demonstrate in your answer some knowledge of confidentiality agreements, and that working with clients, you will always establish that confidentiality agreement before you exchange any other information, always at the start of every session. Well, it depends. So, definitely at the start of your work, and sometimes you might need to remind. Demonstrating how you might handle the conversation. So sometimes you can give an example, and you'd say, right, well, I really appreciate you wanting to share with me, and I think that's really important. Thank you for trusting me. I just want to remind you of what we agreed about confidentiality, and if there's a risk to you or to someone else, I need to go and share that with somebody. I'll always try and talk to you about it first. So doing that in the interview, because what you're doing there is really showing how you would engage in the room. Consider risk and or safeguarding procedures, so you're demonstrating your knowledge of that and your experience of that. And also considering that it may not be a risk or safeguarding thing. Like, think widely. It might just be like a child doesn't want you to tell their mum that they don't like sausages, and they have sausages every Tuesday. It could be something little like that. So it's important to think about it. Again, reflective practice is always going to be in there. So thinking about, what does that bring up in you? Does it feel, if they do tell you something, how do you feel hearing that? How is that going to affect you? Use of supervision, always. An understanding of AP role and clinical responsibility. So, yeah, you just have to understand that you are working under the supervision of a psychologist, and they're responsible. So it's important, and you can explain that to clients and say, look, I'm working under the supervision of a qualified psychologist, so I need to share that with them. If it's a risk thing, whatever it is. So yeah, there are a few things that you can talk about, and that just shows, your experience and how you apply it to a situation. And then you would think, well, so in this situation, I don't know what your local procedures are, but these are the procedures that I would follow. I'd talk to the person first if it was a risk and explain to them what I'm going to do with their information. I'd go and talk to my supervisor. If my supervisor wasn't available, then I'd talk to somebody else. That sort of thing. Sharing the risk, blah, 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 all of that. So some tips. I would think about what you would actually do if the scenario presented itself to you in your current role, because that's the best way that you're going to get an answer, rather than thinking, right, what should I do? Think about what you would actually do, because they're generally the same. If they're not the same, that says to you, okay, maybe the role that you're in isn't quite right, or if you know that you should be doing something but you're not currently doing it, then maybe you need a bit more experience. Remember to think widely about the scenario as well. Things like systemic factors, family, wider procedures and protocols. And then always link back to that AP role if you can. But you're doing that throughout the answer, really. You'd say, so if this happened when I was an AP, this is what it can be that simple. If this happened when I was an AP, this is what I would do. So, well done. You've got to the end of the interview. So, you've finished the interview, you've asked your questions, you've left the meeting if it's online, or you've left the building. Relax. I know it's way easier said than done, but relax. Well done for getting through an AP interview, because they can be really tricky. And if you're new to them, it can feel really different, because it's probably the first role you're applying for where you need your degree. So you do need to show some level of knowledge. Whereas before my AP roles, before my AP interviews, I'd applied for like support worker roles where you didn't need a degree. So they didn't need that level of knowledge in the same way. So they are slightly, it's a slightly step up sometimes. And again, even getting an interview is a massive achievement. Just think about the numbers. If 100 people apply, 10 people are interviewed, you've gone from a 1% chance to a 10% chance. They're still tiny percentages. So and again, not saying that to scare you, just want you to go in with your eyes open and not feel like it's your fault if you don't take things really personally and go, oh, I'm never going to do it, because you will. Reflect. I'm always going to tell people to reflect. It can really help to write the questions down that you had at the end, afterwards if you want to, but just to have it for your records, because that's what I started doing. So I could then think, okay, I wasn't very happy with how I answered that. How would I answer it? If I really had the time to think about it, how would I answer it? Because sometimes not doing well in an interview could be because of nerves. And sometimes it's you just not experienced enough yet. And that is okay. You can't do anything to change that apart from get more experience. So that says to me you're going to do it. It's just not yet. So yeah, you can also write down some of the things that you said as your answer. You think about what went well. What do you think the feedback will be like? Because that's interesting. When you do get your feedback, if it's, no, you weren't successful, do they say the same things? So if you knew you were nervous, do they say, yeah, you came across as quite nervous, which is fine. Like, we appreciate anxiety in psychology, you think. And we expect some level of nerves. But if the nerves are really getting in the way, then there is some work to do around managing those. So seeing if the feedback is the same is important, because if you come out of it going, smash that, I'm definitely going to get it, and they go, oh, no, you didn't answer the question here, you didn't do this, there's some more reflection work that needs to be done, and probably some more experience that needs to be gained. Whereas if you're coming out going, oh, yeah, I didn't really answer that, or I really wish I'd said something that, and they say, oh, really, you were so close, we just wish you'd mentioned the nice guidance. That could be the separating factor between candidates. So if you're on the same page as the feedback, that's always quite helpful. And then what could you do better next time? And that's a nice question to ask. If that doesn't come up in the feedback, it's a good question to ask. What did the successful candidate, what was different between us? That sort of thing. And lastly, be kind to yourself. I spend years beating myself up for not being successful at this. And it's really strange, probably isn't the right word, but I spend most of my time in clinical work, a huge amount of time, helping people to be kind to themselves. That is a goal in a lot of work that I'm doing at the moment, is be kind to yourself. And there's something about the world, I'm going to get off my soapbox in a minute, but there's something about the world that means that we are so critical of ourselves and other people, and we just need to be a bit kinder to ourselves. And remember, the odds of getting an interview are slim, but you did it. That's great. That means your application is looking good. So the next thing you need to do is work on the interview side. And remember, the competition can be really fierce, and the margins are really small between candidates often. So I would say, if I interviewed for between 50 and 60 AP jobs over 5 years, and that is definitely what it would have been, I reckon I was told, oh, you were appointable, but someone just scored a bit higher, or they were internal, or they had experience of working with this client group, or they had experience of doing CBT, or whatever it is. I reckon, certainly in the last couple of years where I was trying to get an AP job, I got that nearly every interview, which is lovely. It's great feedback, but also they're like, we can't really tell you to improve on anything. So it's kind of bittersweet, because you're like, oh, if there was enough funding for another role, I would have got it, so it's tricky. But remember that the competition can be really fierce. And if you are getting that feedback, you're close. It's going to come, because one day you are going to be the most experienced. One day you are going to be the one with the most knowledge. So it's just numbers. It's a numbers game. And you will one day be the top of that pack. So yeah, keep going. Trust me, just keep going. And this, I feel like I don't know. I don't want this to be one of those I just want to cheer you up, mate. It's not supposed to be that. It's each interview is a learning experience, and you are going to grow from each one of them. You just are. If I think about my first interviews, yeah, I was not okay. I needed improvement, and each interview I was like, okay, you get a broader range of questions that you're asked, and you get to practice them, and you get to know yourself a little bit better. And by the time I did get my AP job, as I said, I was like, okay, I've learned everything I can learn. Like, if I don't get it, I don't get it. And take the pressure off yourself. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and best of luck for any assistant psychologist interviews you've got coming up. I really, really hope they go as well as they can. Please pop your tips or any questions or outcomes in the comments. I absolutely love reading all of your comments. I really, really do. And one of my favourite bits about this job, like doing this work, is when people message me and they say, thank you so much for your video. I watched it and I've now got an assistant psychologist job and I'm starting in a month. It's just my favourite thing. So please do let me know if any of these tips have been successful for you. I really do wish you all the best of luck, and thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.
I like to be educated, but I'm so frustrated. Hello to my